Alrighty. So greetings and happy Pride Month, everyone. I'm Carrie Massley, and I'd like to welcome you to our last Society of Mississippi Archivists virtual tabletop for the 2020-2021 season. So over the course of this first season, we feature archivists and historians from across Mississippi who have incorporated social justice themes into their workspaces and projects and research. Before we start, I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping. We will have a brief question and answer session at the end of the presentation, and I will be monitoring those questions on behalf of our presenters. If you could please put those questions into the Q&A box and not the chat box, that would be great, because the chat, only panelists can see what is written there. The Q&A box allows everyone, including participants, to see what is written. So just make sure everything goes into the Q&A box. But I'm not going to talk much longer because I want to go ahead and turn this over to our speakers today. So we have a great group from Mississippi University for Women. We have Nicole Bonaventure Larson, Joshua Herrick, Victoria Jones, and Bridget Pichelle, who will be talking on MUW's LGBT Oral History Collection, From Student Project to Growing Collection. And so, Nicole, I'm going to give you presenter privileges.
No problem.
Oh, I accidentally gave it to Victoria. Sorry about that. Hang on one second. All right, there you go, Nicole. You're good to go.
All right, I'm gonna stop my video real quick to save some internet. Go ahead and share. All right, can everybody see that okay? Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Nicole Bonaventure Larson. I'm the Collection Development Librarian at Mississippi University for Women. The group of us here today have all been or continue to be part of our LGBT Oral History Project at the W. I'm going to go to our next slide and just give everybody a chance to go around and introduce themselves. The order of our photographs here are the order of who's speaking. So I'm have introduced myself now. Bridget, you want to take it away?
I'm sorry. Took me a minute
fine.
to figure out how to unmute myself. I'm Bridget Smith-Pichelle, and I am Professor Emerita of English and Women's Studies at MUW, and also I graduated from the W in 1979.
Josh?
Yeah.
There you go.
So I am a graduate from 2019, and I helped conduct a couple of these interviews over my time at the W, and I took a year off and came back to work for MUW as a full-time professional.
And I am Victoria, or Vic Jones. I'm the Archives and Special Collections Librarian, and I am unfortunately not an alum of the W, but everyone has welcomed me.
Honorary.
An honorary alum, yes. Everyone has welcomed me with open arms, and I'm really happy to be a part of this project.
Thanks, guys. So to start off, I guess what I didn't mention in my introduction is that I am also an alumni. This project was conceived and started during my junior and senior undergraduate years. Hold on. There we go. I've got a little timeline here of kind of what we're going to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk about the beginnings of this project and the way that it started when I was an undergraduate here at the W. And then after I left, there was renewed interest in continuing these oral histories, and I'm going to let Bridget cover that. Josh is going to talk about his experience as a student working on that continued project, and then Victoria is going to talk about what we're headed towards next. So here is, I don't know if you guys can read that really well, but this is baby me with the very first presentation of this project. This was my junior year of college at the W. The project served as my honors thesis and really began because of my participation as a student in the Golden Girls interviews, which Bridget is going to talk about in a little bit. They served as, in many, many ways, a model for the establishment of this project. During that time of working on this initial research and collection, I only had time to collect 3 oral histories, but I focused specifically on lesbian alumni because I was very limited in my access to alumni from other groups within the LGBT community. And I am also a part of the lesbian L section of the LGBT community, and so it was a very personal project for me. Also, it is very time consuming to take and transcribe 3 oral histories on your own. So the formation of the collection was the main portion of my honors thesis. Of course, because it's a thesis, it included a rather large research paper. But the functional aspects of establishing the collection were an essential part of the process of getting the collection into the archives and off the ground, and also were in some ways different than the way that the collection is added to now. All of those decisions about consent forms, embargoes on sharing housing within the archives, all of those things were formulated in conjunction with my history department advisors, with my honors thesis advisors, and with Bridget, with her experience with the Golden Girls interviews. The total time of the project was maybe a full year and a couple months. I took all of the interviews in person during our spring homecoming at the W, which is, for those of you who are not familiar with W homecoming, it is the biggest to do. All the alumni come back. And so it was a great opportunity to get those interviews in. And we did a lot, we being Bridget and myself and Dr. Erin Kemker, who is the head of the History, Political Science, and Geography Department at the W, did a ton of oral history collection training for me to prepare for taking these as an interviewer. Once those were completed and transcribed, they were all gifted to the archives by myself. The copyright on those was not owned by the speakers. And that was intentional so that they could be donated. And Vic will talk a little bit more about that consent form process later. But this was the first 3 that kind of established this collection to begin with. And I am going to let Bridget take it away to talk about what came next. I'm going to mute myself real quick.
Thank you, Nicole. I remember how thrilled I was when you and Dr. Kemker started talking about collecting the oral histories of the lesbians, because that is such an important part of the history of Mississippi University for Women, going back to the to the early years of the school in the late 19th century. I happened to come into the collection of oral histories during what I call the dark ages of archives at MUW. You may not know that briefly in the 1980s, we had a trained archivist who was developing and did develop a really significant collection of papers, photographs, and even oral histories. But after that particular archivist retired, she was not replaced. And the collection of archives, which was in Orr Chapel, the Orr building, was severely damaged by both a tornado and a straight line windstorm and very nearly disintegrated. But I will mention that part of that original collection was 3 tape recordings, and I mean old-fashioned tape recordings, of alums who graduated right after the turn of the 20th century. There's a 1904, 1905, 1906 tape plus transcription that were done by then communication director Margaret Henry, who is still living and still in town here. And she had the foresight during that time to think that it was very important to collect these oral histories of these very early alums. So we have the germ of that oral history collection from that time. And it's important because one of the reasons she decided to collect these was because of the Pauline Orr Scandal, which happened right after the turn of the century and involved Pauline Orr, original faculty member, head of the English department. And frankly, there was a contingent who feared Pauline Orr becoming president one day. She was criticized by then President Henry Whitfield for her standards academically, for her close association with her students and former students. And apparently one of President Whitfield's supporters sent a letter to every state legislator in Mississippi saying that Pauline Orr had been involved in both promoting and criticizing lesbian relationships at MUW, that there was some kind of hotbed there. And there were many people who believed that she had sent that letter, and it caused her retirement and caused people during her lifetime to believe that she had created the scandal in order to get rid of President Whitfield. One thing the letter suggested is the new athletic director, Emma Odie Pooh, was promoting lesbian relationships, etc. So in the 1970s, Margaret Henry began interviewing women who would still remember Pauline Orr as a teacher and the scandal itself to see if she could get to the bottom of what happened. And that's why we have those early recordings. And by the way, the scandal never has been solved. That's still a mystery. But after the archives became neglected, it became a source of worry for me. I was afraid that those papers would be lost. And I finally had the chance to get into that building when a Department of Education grant established a Center for Learning About Women. It was then called the Southern Women's Institute. And one of the key parts that I wanted to establish as part of that center, I was asked to be director, was an oral history collection, because many alums my age had gotten more and more worried that we were losing the stories of alums particularly from the 20s and 30s, women we knew who were dying and we knew had stories to tell. In fact, a committee of the Alumni Association in 2003 and 2004 began this collection, began interviewing women to talk about the influence that a single-sex education had had on them and their promotion of women's equity, the effect on their careers, things that we really considered important in promoting the women's leadership mission of the W. So when I established the official collection, early on, I set up the paperwork so that the interviewees knew that they were giving a part of their memory directly to the archives at MUW, making it by deed of gift a part of the collection, and that they were allowing access to that interview for all types of research and even publicity. And we started doing these interviews at the 50th year reunions of the classes, beginning in 2005. Now, we picked up a few extra ones. It didn't have to be your 50th, it could be your 60th reunion. But that's when we decided would be the best time for students to interview the alums, learn from them, and also learn how to conduct the interview and to transcribe it. We were lucky that the early grant provided a little bit of a stipend to allow me to pay students to do transcriptions. And so that collection began then and has continued every year since then. And now we have a fairly significant collection of Golden Girls interviews. Of course, it was common knowledge among me as an alum and other women that I knew as graduates that a part of the history was the history of lesbians at MUW. And so when Nicole and Dr. Kempker decided that this would be a really important means of collection, I was thrilled. And we were able even to think of women who had been previously interviewed who might also give a lesbian memory, but also to interview people who had graduated within my knowledge as teacher, women that I knew were out, willing to talk, wanted their stories to be heard publicly. Anybody
Sorry,
else?
I could not find the unmute button.
I had that problem too.
Right. So I have a little bit of a timeline here for like how that transition happened. One of the things that I wanted to talk about shortly is that I left as a student at the W in 2013 and then came back as an employee in 2018. And during that time, there was an advisory board formed for the continuation of this particular project. And one of the things that is really impactful about the structure of that board is that it is very interdepartmental.
Right.
Bridget still serves on that board as a community outreach member. Vic and I are both board members. We have board members from the history department, from political science. We recently lost 2 of our board members to job relocation. But the structure is intended to provide a broader outreach and to help with the next thing we're going to talk about, which is having students conduct these interviews, undergraduate students. So Josh, I'm going to skip to you next. If you want to talk about that experience and what that looks like. Vic and Bridget, feel free to jump in about training or anything like that.
Okay.
Yes, feel free to jump in. My memory is a little fuzzy, so I had to do some digging here. So I helped interview the Golden Girls a lot. I wouldn't say a lot. I did it for 2 semesters. That was like a homecoming for my junior and
Yeah.
senior year. And the training we got was pretty quick, but it was thorough. And a lot of the training really established like what expectations were we supposed to have, like what we had prompts and we needed to gauge certain information, but without offending, because that's also a big thing. Because it was also a little awkward as a male interviewing people who went to the university when it was only women, and also being gay myself and interviewing and asking these questions. It could have come off as very in your face of like questions, very blunt, very to the point, but a lot of the training was trying to ease them into that, making them more comfortable, making them understand that we're just trying to get your story. If you don't want to share these details, you're more than happy. We're more than happy not to have, not to say we're not to have them, but you don't have to share if you don't want to.
Right.
So we just really, it was about making them comfortable and getting them. And I don't personally remember recording any names, so I can't say that we took those down or in the interview process. I don't know if I was strictly given a name unless they were introduced to me themselves in the interview process. And one really interesting thing, going back to the male component, is there were some questions about lesbianism at the W, but then I just had like it took me a while to reflect on it as a current male student who is gay. Then I'm like, well, this is what, 2018, 2019, so this is very different in how I'm asking them and like how I'm saying this, how I'm posing my questions. I'm used to this. Whereas they could still be in the closet, they might not want to talk about it, but they're not in the closet. A lot of it is just realizing how the process is, and then how am I going to get this information without causing any harm to them, to their reputation. If it were to go on record and when it's stored, are they going to be anonymous or are they not going to be anonymous? Thankfully, I didn't have much to do with that decision making. That was up to them to disclose to me, and whoever came after me in the interview or transcription process would have to deal with that. Really, those are like the big things that I was challenged with in the interview process. And how many interviews were there? Because there was maybe 10 of us, maybe less. We ran through a lot. I think it interviewed 3 people per session.
Right. We've been averaging
Anything else I'm really
17
missing?
or 8.
Yeah.
17 or 18 per year for the Golden Girls interviews. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was an interesting experience in terms of just reflecting on the time difference and also hearing their perspectives of what it was like at the time, because it was a very different time. Golden Girls, like what year was it? Was it like 60s, 70s?
Well, when we first started, the first 50-year people we interviewed were from the class of 1955.
Mm.
So that, and then of course we had some women from the classes. One was from the 1926 class, few from the 40s. So yes, very, very different times in many ways, not just as far as the single sex education, but economic times. It was interesting to hear from the 1930s alums when things were so difficult financially.
Yeah, it was a lot of it was just recognizing the stark difference in this day and age versus when they went, and like trying to bridge that
Right.
gap without pushing any envelope, well, pushing the envelope, but
Mhm.
in terms of
One
them,
of the
because
things,
not to say, no, sorry, you go.
well, I was going to say one of the things, Josh, during your time, I want to point out that the earliest alums we interviewed, of course, were here when the school was racially segregated.
Mm.
And so as we began to move nearer the date when students were here, when the desegregation happened, we added questions specifically addressing the desegregation, the attitudes toward that. Did they have specific memories? And as a way to move into a different type of record, which I think helped us also establish the oral histories of the first African-American students who attended MUW. Of course, their story is the main story, but also the white alums who were here when that happened. It gives a very interesting perspective as to whether they were angry, accepting, in of course, essentially a racist society on campus. The other thing that you mentioned is that the names mentioned, one of the differences in the Golden Girls collection and in the LGBTQ plus collection is that I established with the Golden Girl collection that there would be no redaction of names, no editing of the original interviews that entered the archives, that all of that, if they mentioned somebody, if they said something negative, if they said something untrue, and that was part of the interview, became part of the original interview. And so we had a disagreement, a professional disagreement as to that rule, and then the later discussion of what would be recorded or redacted in the LGBTQ. And I'd like for you to talk about that a little bit, because you were part of that discussion. And Nicole, you were too. What is appropriate for an archives to collect?
Sure. Josh, do you want to talk first?
Yeah, so in terms of like actually conducting the interviews and me not necessarily being a part of that decision, but hearing about it later on as like professional, like as I am now, I'm middle of the road because I understand both sides and I understand what each side is trying to do and the harm it could provide, and to those that are currently living and those who it will affect later on. As a historian by training, I believe it's best to not necessarily redact it, but I don't know, well, it does fudge up the record, but I like the option of pseudonyms. So that way you have this person, or you can be vague in description, and they would have to search that person down to find it. It's not explicitly stating Sally did this. So Sally is now dragged through the dirt. Like her reputation could affect it. Because I still believe that record should still be upheld because it's history, it's a story, it needs to be told, but also being aware of how it can affect them right now professionally and those they're around professionally, especially in Mississippi if they're still working here, because Mississippi
That's right.
has states or towns, not the entire state. Yeah.
This was definitely something that we have been grappling with since the beginning of this project. The question of, do our interviewees have the right to out other people through the level of access we provide to the interviews? And for that reason, the original 3 were determined to be redacted when made public. So the originals would not be formally redacted, but anything that was accessible by the public would be redacted, only to exclude people from being outed as part of the LGBT community as a protective measure, because we're interviewing people who were alumni in time, not that it's not safe, in a time period in which it was much less safe to be out. And many people of that generation in the LGBT community are still not out. So I think Vic is going to talk a little more about the updated consent forms and how we are still moving through these kinds of decisions as an advisory board, as we are planning to start with new interviews. Carrie, are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, we have it's 12:30 right now.
Okay.
So, you have 15, 20 more minutes. As long as we could reserve at least 10 minutes at the end for questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cannot see a clock with this PowerPoint up here. So I guess I'll use that as a segue to let Vic talk about what some of that access looks like now for our existing interviews.
Yeah.
Um,
So I came to the W in 2019 and I began in this position in 2020. So at the tail end of everything that Bridget and Nicole and Josh are talking about. And so I sort of got the product of their work and their labor. And my goal was to make the interviews accessible because prior to that point, they were only available if you physically came into the archive and the library, which for students on campus prior to 2020 wasn't like an undue strain. But if you were someone wanting to listen to these and you were anywhere outside of the Golden Triangle region, so this area of Mississippi, that could be really difficult. And so wanting to make these more accessible, and while this was sort of something that I know that the board and people had in the library had been interested in prior to that, I came into this position in June 2020, so we all knew COVID was happening and accessibility and coming into the archive physically was either going to be non-existent or extremely limited. So our goal was really to make it more accessible, not for these interviews in particular, but also for the other interviews that we have available. And so it really has been an interdepartmental collaboration from the beginning, right? So with the English department and the history department and our Women's Research Center and the archive and the library, it just really involved a lot of people across campus working together and also working with students from different departments. So we have students who are employed by the archive who are working on aspects of the interviews, and we also have students from especially like the history department who were working on transcription, like Josh mentioned and Nicole did. And so we have those, and then the audio files, which are redacted, right? That is something that we do in the archive, and redacting those audios and double checking the transcripts. That's all like the labor that takes place in the archive and that I oversee and work with students on. So that is, and then cross-checking with other stakeholders across campus. And so it's a lot of collaboration, which I think is really fantastic, quite frankly. So after getting all of that part done, at this point, when I was getting prepared to upload the interviews onto our digital repository, in some cases, it had been years since these interviews had taken place. And so I wanted to make sure that we were reaching out to our alum and just sort of like, hey, this alum you did in 2014, like it's actually going to be made available online. And I know that we talked about this when you originally did your interview, but now it's like really, really happening. And so I reached out to I chose four interviews from this project as sort of our flagship, if you will, to put online. And a lot of that was because I felt comfortable with where they were, like having been processed. And I was able to contact these people, which is, of course, a big deal. And so I worked with Amanda Clay Powers, the Dean of the Vamp Memorial Library, as well as Nicole, in trying to draft a really good sort of like re-consent form because we had the initial consent forms, which in a lot of places, it did explicitly state, you know, like we agreed to make this available online at some point in the future. But I think we can all agree that like that's kind of vague at some point in the future, online where, online how. And so I reached out to each of the individuals and I said, hey, this is what it looks like. I was able to go ahead and put it online and send them a private link to make sure that it was something that they were still okay with. And that's, I don't know if everyone can read this letter because it is kind of a small print, but it's
Let's see.
basically reminding what the project is and what the purpose of it is and how their interviews have been used, and then showing them what it looks like in its current iteration. And so I got mostly all positive responses, although some involved some follow-up. And this was again another point where it also involved some interdepartmental collaboration because I didn't have all of the most updated contact information for everyone. So I had to reach out to Alumni Affairs and Development. And it was sort of, I think they know about this project, but I kind of had to like re-pitch the project to them to get them to send me the contact information for people, which I did not really expect when I called them, but ended up being a really great because it's a good department to have support from, of course.
True.
So that was sort of this like consent and then reconsent part that we did. And then the next part was actually making these available on Athena Commons. So that's what we call our digital repository here at the W. Oh, that's the previous slide, Nicole. And I'm not sure how many of our participants and people watching are using the bpress digital commons. To be really honest, it is not that difficult to upload items into the digital commons. It's primarily spreadsheet work, and it's more just being really detailed and focused and making sure that I'm copying things from different metadata formats into the format that I need to upload it. Choosing the keywords, I use Library of Congress subject headings, making sure, double checking the format types, the lengths of the audios, stuff like that. And then the other side of the slide is what it looks like when you get to the web page. And it includes the description or abstract, the title, of course, the creators. We didn't include images from this for this collection. And so I just used a thumbnail in place of that. Nobody really, when I reached out to the alum, nobody seemed real enthusiastic about including an image or a photo. And that wasn't a part of the original consent or projects. And so I just sort of was like, if you're okay with this, this is what will be made available online. And out of the 4 interviews, 3 of the 4 people seemed to be totally fine. There was no really follow-up or pushback. It was just like, okay, cool. And then I did have one person who was a little concerned with like the public availability of the interview after the fact. So initially in the consent form, you know, she had said okay, and then coming back, she was like, you know, having time and distance from having done this, re-listening to the audio, I feel less comfortable with this than I initially did, which quite frankly, I was not sure how the re-consent aspect would go initially, but just knowing that there was even
I would have said tough.
that there was even one person who was a little bit worried about it, for me made it worthwhile just because I don't know, I worry about people. Obviously, I'm an archivist and I love things, but I worry about people. But we came to, after a little bit of, I don't want to use back and forth in a negative way, but after a conversation, we did come to the conclusion that she would feel a lot more comfortable if it was just like MUW affiliates who were able to access it, or people who were physically on campus, which is what would already been happening. And so I was pretty sure that I could make this work. I was maybe a little overly confident, but we got there. And putting this behind a proxy login. And so you have to have an MUW ID and password like any student, faculty, or staff member would have. Or if you are on campus and using like our internet and servers, you'd be able to access it as well. Otherwise, you'd have to contact me directly. And at that point, I would probably just do a case-by-case basis and have to recontact the alum, and we'd have to set something up. But this just really gave us a little bit more control over who is accessing it and for what purposes. And it seemed like a good middle ground between not having it available online at all or having it completely available. So this took some coordinating between ITS and BPress. And it was, again, sort of a re-explaining of what I've been doing and what was not a secret, but some people were surprised by. So I really enjoyed it, and it was a good learning process. We had to kind of make some edits, and it's currently still sort of going through those edits, so you shouldn't be able to see it if you were to go to our website right now. But I'm hoping that that will be finalized in the next day or two. And so check back in with me next week, I guess.
Vic, I have a question that I've been meaning to ask you this. A good many of the Golden Girls who were interviewed have died. I assume that you wouldn't have to seek extra permission from anybody else who had already signed those permission forms before they died.
No, I wouldn't for those, because I specifically knew that these people were still alive, and even in some cases like active in their careers and things like that. It was why I was particularly concerned.
Yes.
But for stuff like that, I would have just posted it. Thank you, Bridget. And then for next steps, there are some interviews that have not been fully transcribed yet. And so as we get more students back on campus and more students working in the archive and more students doing internships, I hope to fill out those transcriptions. I sort of made the decision that in order to sort of honor the original purpose of the institution, quite frankly, and the project specifically, that it should be as students as much as possible doing as much of the research as like a learning process.
Right.
And which kind of goes into point number 3, but I'll follow up with that in a moment. And then point 2 is I really think we need to do like a post, if you will, COVID reassessment. A lot of people were doing virtual interviews for oral histories this past year. We did not for this project, but I would like to sort of open the door for that going forward, especially as we have
a great idea.
Who are getting older and may not feel comfortable traveling here. In order to do the interviews in person, I'd like to give the option of doing a virtual interview. I think that could widen our scope and sort of making sure that we're constantly sort of reassessing, like who exactly are we interviewing, how are we reaching out to these alum, and what do we want this project to ultimately look like. And I think this is a good point in time to have sort of that checkpoint.
One thing we were fortunate with in the early Golden Girls interviews, we happened to have a student who was particularly dedicated to interviewing. Her name is Amber King. She's a college English teacher now. She took it upon herself to drive to interview women who could not come to campus, and we would not have those interviews if she had not gone. And I think virtual interviews, that's the direction we need to go. You know, it'll allow us so much better access.
I'm really hoping that it would help us to collect more interviews for people. And then step 3 is, of course, we would like to do more interviews. And that involves training students and working both with actual alumni and like the alumni department. We didn't have a homecoming due to COVID this past year. Our sort of like delayed homecoming will be this August. So I really see that as like a kickoff point to restarting
Yes.
not just this particular oral history project, but like Golden Girls as well.
Right.
And that is going to involve training students and training them quickly because it's the end of August. And so thinking about that, and for putting these specific interviews online, this year I did that. I did the metadata for that and I put that online. Moving forward, I would really like to see that also be a step that students are taking. I think it fits in line with a lot of work that we're doing in other areas with archives and our digital studies program.
Yes.
And talking about metadata and what metadata looks like, especially in a digital environment, and talking about the preservation aspects of both like physical and digital mediums. And so I really see that this as being essentially a student-run, if kind of type project that is overseen by faculty and staff.
Vic, your plan is literally the culmination of this dream I had, and I never imagined that you would have this kind of knowledge and access. It's just wonderful. I get excited every time I think about it, and to have students be able to learn to work with that data, that's such a fabulous internship.
I'm really excited about it. I've done some test runs, I guess, with students working with metadata this past year, and it's been quite successful. So I'd like to roll that out in other areas. And then the fourth and final thing is research. I would like to see people using these collections and doing research, doing projects, using it to learn more about the W, or using it to learn more about the LGBT plus community, and using it to learn more about the South and historic women's universities. So I think the opportunities are endless for research and scholarship, as well as just like training and learning for students. So I'm super excited to see where we can take this project. And I'm happy to have been brought on board to sort of help put Bridget's dream into practice.
I'm so excited to know you.
Bridget, you know I adore you, so this is fantastic. I guess I'll open it up to questions and maybe cheat also a little bit and say we are also really interested in hearing from participants, especially on our decisions around redaction.
Yes.
You've clearly seen from the rest of us talking, this is an ongoing conversation that we've had, and we'd really like to open the floor to other people to get your opinions.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions or comments, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A box. That way everyone can see them, and we'll take them as they come.
I am going to go ahead and stop the share and, cut video back on and stuff.
We do have a comment from Nancy Young. She's with Smith College, and she did want to mention that she was having kind of trouble tuning in just because of, the nature of our job and multitasking, all that good stuff. I think she's like in the middle, like in the stacks. Yeah, she says she's like currently trying to listen to this in the stacks. So good for her for trying. But she said that this sounds like a fabulous project, and she hopes to hear and read more about it in the future. Best wishes from Smith College Special Collections.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we have a question from Jennifer Overstreet. She says, this question is for Victoria. For metadata, how have you heard of or have you considered using Homosaurus to enhance the discoverability of these interviews?
Yeah, that's a really great question. When I was doing these, when I initially did the subject headings for these interviews, I think we all recognize that the Library of Congress subject headings are not the best, and that's why Homosaurus exists. I went ahead and only used LCSH just as a standard and as a base to getting this up there, I think moving forward that's probably the move that we'll make. And it just, in this first iteration of it, I just didn't do it in the interest of time, to be really frank and honest. But I think that's definitely where we will ultimately have to go.
Great. Another question is, in establishing a committee for this project, who were the stakeholders?
Bridget, I think that is a you question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's really important that, at least in my opinion, that we have alumni representation, that we have a connection with the Columbus community, because so many of the stakeholders are also connected to the Columbus community. So I think that was important. We need to have current students, because they're stakeholders in this information, and how it's used is their as one of the things that they learn from on campus. I think that having faculty representation is extremely important, because I believe that this information is both a teaching and a learning tool. And if we have this information in our archives, all archives information ought to be used all the time. It's not just something that we keep in the past. It's something that teachers from many different areas could use as part of their classroom instruction, and not just in history or political science or literature, but also in the sciences. When you interview significant alums who have done scientific research, it could be used there. So those are the stakeholders that I thought about initially.
Okay, great. Does anyone want to add to that? All right. So we have another question. It said, did people consider Emma Odie to have a personal lesbian/gay agenda with putting on junior freshman weddings? And you may need to explain what junior freshman wedding is, right, to people who, aren't part of the initiated, us MUW people.
Miss Poole established the ceremony as a way to make a connection between sister classes, and as a way to promote retention and to build relationships that were meant to last after they left campus. I don't think it was a personal lesbian agenda, because at the time she established this was kind of a popular idea that had sprung up in Eastern women's colleges. It's not something that involved personal relationships, but symbolic relationships. I think we view it today in the lens of all kinds of different ways, and I think it can be analyzed as a lesbian trope, also a trans trope, gender bending. But as she initially established, there had been kind of a burlesque version of this, a comic version of this, before she came in 1913. No, I'm sorry, she came in 1910. It was right after the turn of the 20th century. And she decided to make it fancier and fancier and invite public attendance, mainly because she knew that programs like this gave attention to the campus in ways that she wanted the attention to occur. It was elitist. The costumes were extremely expensive, but it was also, I've said enough, that's.
Okay. Mona Van Lee. Hey, Mona. She writes, I may have missed it, but has there been any research publications or additional projects that have been done from these oral histories?
One thing that the grant allowed us to do at the Center for Women's Research and Public Policy was to publish a collection of oral histories. And the students collected these histories, transcribed them, but I was editor of that collection. I provided footnotes for clarification when people were mentioned. I frankly edited out racist comments. The whole purpose of this publication was to promote donations to the school and to talk about our history as a women's institution. But I edited out passages that I thought might be offensive to readers. And that has to do with my initial plan. That is, these interviews and these transcriptions are available in their entirety to anybody who wants to look at them. But how I chose to use them was different. I sought out themes. I sought out mentions of particular ideas. And so that is a publication that stemmed from this. Mississippi University Press was the one that published it. But that's only one example of something that you could do from it. I don't consider that an academic publication. I consider that more of a publicity publication.
Just to add some clarification, the oral histories that Bridget's talking about now are from the Golden Girls interviews. The LGBT oral histories specifically have not had any research publications on them yet, probably largely in part due to the fact that they haven't been accessible to people outside of the library or students that are involved in the library up until this point. But maybe when we get enough, we could put out something similar.
Yeah.
Right, that was going to be my next question, is if you would consider doing something similar to the Golden Girls publication, but with this set of oral histories.
Yeah, I think if we had the like enough interviews and enough voices, that's definitely something like I at least personally would be interested in doing something similar or doing something like that. But right now I think we're just, limited by where we're at in the project.
I think that's important. I think it takes a long time to collect anything that you can publish from. We were lucky that we had interviews from 1926 through 1956 when we published Golden Days. I can't imagine, it seems like you would really need a 10-year period at least before you could do something similar.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you guys are well on your way to accomplishing that. So thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to go ahead and take the presenter privileges back from Nicole. Just quickly share a little content here. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. I think my screen's a little messed up, so I apologize if it looks kind of funky. There we go. So thank you everyone for joining us today for our last table talk for the 2020-2021 season. We do have another season coming up. We will be sending out the call for presenters very, very soon. The theme for our next season will be Ask an Archivist. So if you are an archivist in Mississippi or outside of Mississippi, we are very interested in having archivists from other areas of the United States or the globe. If you have something that you feel particularly strongly about, like you feel like you're an expert at that, whether it be preservation or conducting oral histories, any subject that you think that you are an expert in this area of archival studies, we want to encourage you to submit a proposal. And if you are interested in giving a talk or have any questions about giving a talk, you can contact me directly. My email is cmasterly@library.mstate.edu. Or if you just want to learn more about SMA, you can check us out at our website at mississippiarchivist.org. So again, I really want to thank our speakers for being here today and giving us some insights into their two oral history projects that they've had going on. And hopefully our listeners today have gotten some really good ideas on how they can implement similar programs at their institutions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this virtual table talk out. But happy Pride, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.